anyone who is new to a Gairloch Museum event. My name is Karen Buchanan. I'm curator at Gairloch Museum, and I'd like to kick off this evening as usual by thanking Museums Gallery Scotland and Art Fund, who are both supporting the event tonight. And I have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Steph Piper. Steph is an associate lecturer in archaeology at the University of York, researching the prehistoric occupation of the Scottish coasts and islands. She specialises in stone tool analysis and how this can reveal the extent of hunter-gatherer mobility and social connections. I'm now going to hand over to Steph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and Fáilte everybody, and that's the extent of my Gaelic. I'd really like to thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be sharing my research with you today, and it's going to basically take you through a long walk around Loch Ewe and Gairloch in Westeros, and just share with you some of the preliminary results that we've got from the survey. So yeah, really just like to thank you all for coming, and thank Karen as well for that lovely introduction. I must say that this research was done whilst I was at Newcastle University as well, although I'm trying to continue to write things up as we go along. So hopefully, even after lecturing for a year, I'll still click the right button and present and share the right. There we go. Okay, if everyone can still hear me okay, and I can maybe, Karen, could you let me know you can see the screen all right?
I can see it, your slides, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. I can't see you though, so I'll have to wait till the end to be able to see you again. So I'm going to talk to you, as I said, about this long walk that basically we took around the coast of Westeros, and go from prehistory to the present, but probably take you back from the present into prehistory, because I'm a prehistoric archaeologist, so that's where my interests and my love lies. But I am really, really passionate about coastal archaeology generally, and the importance of preserving our coastal archaeology, regardless of the time period that it's from, because as you'll come to see as we go through the presentation, that climate change is really, really affecting all of our coastal archaeology. So it's really, really important that we preserve this. So a little bit of a background, an outline to how the evening's going to progress. I'll introduce you to some of the problems and the challenges that we have in relation to coastal erosion and archaeology in Scotland, and then take you through into the prehistory in the Western Highlands. So I've pitched this really that if you've seen a little bit of Time Team, then hopefully this should be perfectly understandable for you, and for any professionals in the audience, more than welcome for you to correct me on anything that's outside of my my prehistoric time zone. So that's about the level that I'm going to talk at. So hopefully nothing hugely complicated in terms of radiocarbon dates and things like that. And I'll also introduce you to why Westeros. Why is it that I came to wind up in this particularly lovely part of the world? Then I'll take you through some of the results from the survey that we did in April in 2019, and the results of a very, very small scale excavation that was able to conduct as part of the project in the following June. I just got some initial results from that, and then go on to talk about the future prospects as well. So what is it that this survey has been able to tell us? What do we know? What can we learn from it? And also, what is it that we're going to do in the future, or hope to do in the future? So a little bit of background context. So there we are, looking out across Loch Ewe from the beautiful campsite at Ewe. It's just one of the most stunning sunsets, and I think that was taken at about 11:30 at night. It was just absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, if you're, we've all been stuck inside for a very, very long time. So hopefully this will, begin to bring the outdoors in a little bit and give you some big vistas. So as a result of the Historic Environment Scotland Climate Change and Risk Assessments report that was published in 2019, some of the results that have shown as a consequence of this report and the data that's been collected has shown that in Scottish coastal archaeology since the 1960s, there's been a 1 degree rise in temperature on average. And that the Scottish coastline now is, or Scotland in general, is experiencing 21% more precipitation. And as a consequence of global heating, more generally, that sea level rise is happening in around about the order of 3 millimeters per year, and it's speeding up. So based on those that accumulated data, the predictions under a high emissions scenario, so if as global heating continues, if no mitigation is done by all countries to try and offset some of the carbon emissions and global heating generally, that by 2050, Scotland will experience a sea level rise of between 16.5 to 28.1 centimetres, so really quite substantial. The temperature in Scotland will rise by around 2 to 3 degrees, which in some cases on a lovely, lovely summer's day, like it's been, well, summer-like day it's been today, no bad thing perhaps, but of course this has huge, huge implications for the world over. So it comes with serious consequences, and also a greater rate in precipitation. So less precipitation in summer, but greater precipitation in winter. And I think all of this combined, also midges. I'm just going to mention midges because Scotland. So really, there's some incredibly significant effects that are predicted if nothing changes about the way that we tackle global heating. And this has huge implications for the coastal archaeology. Now, the threats to coastal archaeology have been very, very well known in Scotland, and for quite a long time, since 1996, there have been coastal zone assessment surveys being conducted, and these have been conducted around large parts of the Scottish coastline, but as it stands, only 30% of the Scottish coastline has been surveyed. So for all that, we've got an incredible amount of information about these sites that exist in those zones. There's still huge areas of the coastline that hasn't been surveyed. And if you can see my pointer, of course, I'll draw your attention to the Northwest Highlands, where we're going to be focused today, and how empty this area is. Now, these have been compiled into the Scottish archaeological research frameworks. So these have been done on both a national and a regional level. And another shout out to Susan Cruz, who've been amazingly supportive in helping me work up some of the information from the ongoing Highland archaeological research framework. And they're doing incredible work with that. So these reports are showing us the combined information of coastal assessment surveys, but also the archaeological resource of all these regions as well, so not just in the coastal zone. And the Scape Trust, the Scottish Coastal Archaeology and the Problem of Erosion, who are based at St Andrews with Tom Dawson and Joanna Hambley, have been synthesising this coastal data and just beginning to show and draw out some of these problems on a more specific level. And Tom Dawson and Joanna Hambley have written really, really excellent reports that basically give us research priorities and targets for what it is that we need to do in research in the coastal zone. Sorry, I'm quite thirsty today. So I'm going to now take you to the Highlands and the prehistoric occupation of the Highlands, but I'd like you to sort of hold that information in your head as we go through just the effects and the importance of the coastal zone to understanding coastal archaeology. So the Mesolithic period in Scotland, this is the Middle Stone Age period. And in Scotland, the earliest dates are around about 8,500 calibrated BC, or before the Common Era. And this lasts to the arrival, the introduction of farming, agricultural practices, and different lifeways with the Neolithic around about 4,000 BCE. So this lasts around about 4,000 years, but that is by no means the earliest evidence. There are tantalising glimpses of the Paleolithic as well, so the Upper Stone Age in and around Scotland. But it's I don't have a lovely map to show you of that. And the Mesolithic is my period. That's the period that I studied for my PhD. I spent a lot of time out in the Western Isles of Scotland doing it, looking at new sites out there. So this is where my passion lies, and this is where really the impetus to start investigating the Highlands really came from, because as you can see, this distribution map of the sites that's been taken from the Highland research framework shows that the Northwest Highland zone is completely devoid of Mesolithic sites. And I was just really, really struck by this, because we know that it wasn't until 2001 that we got evidence for the Mesolithic period in the Western Isles, for example. Prior to that, Kinloch and Rum, which is, where's my pointer gone? Kinloch and Rum down here, this was up till not too long ago, their site of the earliest Mesolithic evidence. Actually, the earliest Mesolithic evidence is now known at Cramond by Edinburgh. So this is really, really interesting and really exciting, because a lot of the dates that we have on the western seaboard are quite early in the Mesolithic. So it doesn't really make much sense as to why this area is so empty, because we know that Mesolithic people were incredibly capable of moving around between the mainland and the islands, lived a very, very coastal way of life. So why this gap? And hopefully, as we move through the course of the presentation, you'll come to understand why. As we move through into the Neolithic period, then, from this distribution of chambered cairns, we can see, okay, the northwest zone is a little bit better represented, but still, there are still quite some large blank spaces, particularly when we contrast that with what we know from the East Coast. And as we look at the distribution of pottery, for example, so well-known Neolithic pottery, again, the distribution of pottery is really quite sparse. And again, through axe heads as well, this is quite sparse again along this coastal zone, which is really, really interesting, because as I'll come to show you towards the end, is that this has really strong implications for the way that we understand the spread of the Neolithic lifeways through Scotland. So this is quite exciting and quite tantalising, the results that I'm going to share with you later on. Then as we move through into later prehistory, into the Bronze Age, again, we see this eastern coastal bias with the burials, and also with the existence of metalwork, and also with the existence of characteristic arrowheads. So this is just a small sample of the different distribution maps that have been generated through the Highland research framework. And again, it just shows how blank this area of the Northwest Highlands is. So my question is, where are the prehistoric inhabitants of the Highlands? Do they just not exist? I don't believe that's true for a moment. I think it's something to do with research bias. And I think it's to do with the fact that generally developer-funded archaeology is concentrated on the urban zones, so the Central Belt, for example, and also the urbanised eastern coastlines. It also coincides with previous archaeological surveys and investigations, so for example, by the Historic Commission. And also it's a result of where archaeologists like to dig, particularly researchers. And it's perhaps not well, you've already noticed that I'm English, and the research done by English universities up in Scotland is a really, really long way to come. So I think it's just all part of this bias, really, is that for for many people that research this area, it's considered as remote, and that's how it's marketed. It's wild, it's distant, it's other. And I think that's really a misnomer, because for those of you who live in this region, that's your home, that's the center of your universe. And I think that it's really a mistake to consider as the northwest area of Scotland as kind of this remote, far-flung area, because this would have been the centre of the world to the people that inhabited it. It's just difficult to get to for us. And we know from the way that the incredibly dense later prehistoric occupation of the Orkney Islands, of Shetland, you know, this was a central axis of trade. So it's really striking just how empty this area is. And so, yeah, I just didn't believe at all that nobody lived here in prehistory, essentially. So this is why I wanted to come and have a look. So why Westeros? It seems to be there's obviously a whole span of the northwest seaboard to investigate. So why is it that I picked Westeros? Well, previously there have been 2 successful survey projects. Caroline Wickham-Jones and Karen Hardy ran the Scotland's First Settlers project between 1998 and 2004. And through that project, they surveyed most of the eastern coastline of Skye, around the Inner Sound, around the Applecross Peninsula, around the islands of Rasay and Scalpay, and they identified 129 new archaeological sites. Just through walking over the coastline, investigating eroding areas, investigating places that likely had prehistoric and later occupation, and 48 of those new sites identified were prehistoric. And then, so that's the area of that is there in the pink on the map. And then up further to the north is the Ullapool to Loch Ewe Coastal Zone Assessment Survey that was conducted in 1996. So as part of that, there were 192 archaeological sites identified, 136 of them which were new, and 15 of these were prehistoric. So basically, my project was a case of, let's just fill in the gap. We've got to start somewhere. So we might as well focus in on somewhere and an area that has got good evidence, if somewhat limited evidence, for prehistoric occupation, and see how this fits. How does this tie in? How can we start to fill in those empty edges of the Northern Highlands? So basically, what better way to do it than to pick up where they left off? Now, coastal archaeology has some challenges, and prehistoric archaeology also has some challenges. When you combine the 2 together, we're really facing a lot of challenges, but it's not impossible. We just need to know where to look and what to look for. So if you cast your mind back a few slides to thinking about that rate of sea level rise that's been happening. Well, sea level rise has been happening since the end of the last ice age. Over 10,000 years ago was the last hurrah of the ice age, with the what's known as the Loch Ewe readvance, when there was a very cold blip for about 1,000 years, in which the Loch Ewe, that's the extent of the ice sheet, basically recovered the Highlands for a while. But sea level rise since the end of the ice age, I'd say, happened a broad date, about 14,000 years ago. The huge ice sheets started to melt, and sea level has then been rising. Now, as a consequence of those big ice sheets that were covering the land, as well as areas of central Scotland during the Loch Ewe readvance, then the weight of those ice sheets essentially compress the Earth's crust, because ice is incredibly heavy. Now, when that starts when they start to melt, not only are they beginning to put the meltwater into the sea, but then that's also releasing the weight and the pressure from the land. So the land begins to rise, and that's what's called isostatic uplift. And this has been happening around the southwest area of Scotland since around 10,000 years ago. And it's been happening at various rates, and sea level rise has also been happening at various rates. And it all depends on the coastal morphology, essentially. It's very, very complicated to model. And the data isn't that's not a good resolution of the data, shall I say. But we know, based on those predicted models from the report that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, basically the rate of sea level rise is no longer offset by that rebound. So the rate of sea level rise is going to start happening quicker. So that means that those shorelines, those preserved sites, and all that landscape that has been rebounding faster and lifting up is now beginning to become inundated. So those sites that were preserved are now becoming increasingly threatened. And of course, any sites that have been built close to the coastline ever since. So that is one of our hugest challenges that we're facing. There are also problems in the fact that I mentioned about the extreme variation in precipitation. So less precipitation less rain in the summer, more in the winter. And also with increased sunshine, it basically means that this is going to cause greater instability for sloping ground. There's risks of flooding. There's also risks of huge erosion events through drying out and destabilization of cliffs as well. And I've experienced this in the Western Isles with the Macha, with the sand dune systems, is that from year to year, we might not find new archaeological sites, but then just one very, very dry year, coupled with some quite aggressive storms that come through in the autumn, can scour away the sand dunes and expose sites in a matter of hours or days or weeks. So this is happening very, very rapidly, but at varied rates. So we might have stabilisation for some years, and then an event might happen very, very quickly. So this is a huge challenge. So it's not directly coming from the sea, but the coastal zone is very, very vulnerable from the landward side as well. For prehistoric archaeology, the trouble is for me as an early prehistoric archaeologist, is that we don't have very many upstanding monuments. The archaeology to us is generally invisible. So prior to the Neolithic, when we do start getting monumental architecture, so standing stone circles, chambered cairns, tombs, these kinds of things, these are visible from the surface. But anything earlier than that, we just don't have that kind of architecture, and it becomes buried. And particularly in Scotland, we have really extensive peat formation, and in some cases in the Highlands, the peat can be up to 6 meters thick. And this has been happening since deglaciation. So it's burying the archaeology very, very rapidly, and also it's very, very difficult to detect. So I'm interested in stone tools, as Karen said in her lovely introduction. You can't detect that through the geophys that Time Team use. It's just too invisible. It's really, really difficult to find. So this is really, really challenging. And of course, I mentioned the difficulty of access sometimes. So all of these factors combined actually mean that when coastal erosion happens, it can give us a window into these buried land surfaces and these sites that are directly underneath the peat or in the cliff faces that we might not ordinarily be able to find through geophysics or through field walking, without agriculture in much of the Highland zone, because of it's very mountainous and very boggy and covered in heather, where we don't have agriculture and ploughing, and we can't do field walking either. So there's quite a lot of factors that make things really complicated. So using climate change, and I don't ever want to say that it's an opportunity because that makes it sound too positive, but it's a facilitator that means we can utilize those moments in time to look at this archaeology that we ordinarily wouldn't have access to, and therefore preserve it or record it before it is lost. So that's why it's really, really important. So with that in mind, introducing the project. So this is KAIROS. Funding bodies like snazzy acronyms for some reason. I couldn't think of one that was really snazzy, so we had to go with Coastal Archaeology and Erosion in Westeros. And basically, I had two research aims. We wanted to establish the potential of using these eroding coastlines to yield early prehistoric sites in the Northwest Highlands, but also, as we were doing this, contribute to the active monitoring of the archaeological sites at risk of erosion. So not just focusing on the prehistory, but also being aware that archaeology of all ages and our modern built heritage as well is also at risk. So here we are looking over Loch Ewe towards, I think that's Firemore Bay in the background, if any of you are Gairloch natives. So in April 2019, I always want to say last year, but it wasn't last year, 2 years ago, I set out with two of my master's students from Newcastle University and a colleague from Durham University to basically focus in and around on Loch Ewe in the Gairloch parish. And for 8 days we intended to, although it really only became 6 because we had a phenomenal storm on the second day. Basically, we just want to walk and look, and that's what we intended to do. We wanted to stick within about 50 metres of the shoreline of the high water line to make sure that we were capturing the eroding archaeology or archaeology that might be a risk of erosion, but also whilst maintaining health and safety, making sure that we're not going to fall off any cliffs. And basically just record any new sites that we found, so just photograph them, take the GPS points, and basically have a look at the known sites as well, because there's a lot of known archaeology that exists in this area, and see if that was eroding as well. So I'm going to, here's a map of our plan. So day one, we went around the top of the peninsula there. On day 3, as I said, day 2, we had a horrific storm, which was absolutely brilliant. So we walked all the way along here on day 3. Day 4 and 5, we had to change tack a little bit because we knew we were running out of time. So a lot more extensive walking back up the eastern shores of Loch Ewe, but also driving over to bays as well, where there's a good potential for archaeological evidence. And also on day 6, we hopped over to Little Grenagh and took in some other archaeological sites as well. So really targeting those bays is based on what I've learned through my previous research in the West Niles, is that in the past, in prehistory, people tend to like fishing, and they tend to like occupying nice sheltered bays that have got good potential for fishing opportunities, but also good access to inland resources. And they tend to be located in and around these types of areas. So that's why we targeted those bays. And this is a model that's been replicated across Scandinavia as well, and it works really, really well. So to go back in time then, what was our results? What did we find? So from the very, very modern period, we've got evidence for modern fishing industry. And here at Mel and Charles, there is a scallop or an abandoned scallop factory. If anyone in the audience has any information on this, it would be wonderful, because I have no idea. I can't find any information on it at all. All I know is that we've seen is an abandoned building. And it looks like this scallop factory was in use for quite a long period of time, because incorporated all the white on the beach are scallop shells, and they're mixed into the ground surface in and around the building. So it's obviously been in use for a very long time as the ground has built up and stabilized around it. So that's really, really interesting and insightful. It's a modern building, but we don't have any information on it. So it's still important archaeology, and it's part of our built heritage. So yeah, it would be really fascinating to know if that's part of anybody's history. And round the coast near Cove, there are these wonderful tiny little bothies that we stumbled upon. And I don't want to murder the Gaelic, so I'll try and refrain from pronouncing anything at any point. But these wonderful little fishermen's bodies, I can only assume, have been made out of plywood. They've been made out of bits of boat, bits of tubs. They're really, really tiny. They're just, we kind of had a look through one of them, and there's just a bed in there, the width of a single bed. And they've just, obviously for drawing up, like if you bring up your small fishing vessel onto the shore and can overnight there until perhaps the weather clears or something. And these, again, these are wonderful because they're not very substantial structures. They're made of all kinds of flotsam and jetsam, and they're not recorded in any way. And this is just really a wonderful insight into your heritage and your history, and part of what goes on in and around Loch Ewe. So I think these are really, really important and fascinating structures that are worth sort of knowing more about, really. As we step a little bit further back in time, then for those of you who live around Loch Ewe and Gairloch will know that Loch Ewe played an absolutely crucial part of the Second World War. And it was a base for the Russian Arctic convoy from 1941. And this is the battery at Cove, and here you can see some of the gun emplacements and the searchlight emplacements. And basically the function of the Russian Arctic convoy was to transport supplies up through around the Arctic Circle, around the northern coasts of Norway, into the northern Russian ports of Murmansk and Archangel. And by then, from there, the supplies, munitions, food, everything was supported and transported down to St. Petersburg. And this was a really, really dangerous mission, not only because it was going up through the Arctic Circle, through some incredibly harsh winter conditions. Of course, traveling around the Norwegian coast was really dangerous because it was occupied by the Germans. And this is really, really significant as well, because the Loch Ewe was such a tactically important area for this, and it must have been an incredible surprise, to the local inhabitants when all the soldiers came to the area. And apparently, I've heard stories just speaking to the local historians that apparently it was so busy at one point that you could just walk across from one side of Loch Ewe to another over the boats. There's a huge boom defence across the entrance to the loch as well to stop the U-boats from coming in as well. So it was really, really important. But we don't really know a great deal about these buildings. Who were these people? We've got some oral histories, we've got some documentation, but of course, because it was such an important part of the war effort, a lot of this information may still remain classified or top secret. So there's still a lot of questions left to be answered about that. Also, as part of the Second World War infrastructure, are these 3 lifeboats that were being washed up, and these are from the American Liberty ship, the USS William H. Welch. And unfortunately, during a really severe storm, as the ship was heading, it docks at Loch Ewe as it was taking water ballast from London across to New York. Unfortunately, it hit one of the islands and foundered on a reef during a really severe storm. And unfortunately, out of the 74 crew, there were only 16 survivors. But there's this wonderful memorial here that's been erected through local donations that speak to the bravery of all the local inhabitants of Cove and Gairloch, who worked incredibly hard in these in the conditions to try and save those souls. And so those 3 lifeboats are still there. Unfortunately, apparently they were never used, but they're really at extreme risk of loss, which is a real shame because they're very, very important artifacts to this event. So that's really important and significant as well. So I think it's incredible to think that when the archaeology perhaps that you see, maybe you walk this coastline every day and you see these artifacts and these monuments, is that because they're there and they're visible, we know all about them. But I think really there's so many more questions left to be answered. As we step even further back in time, back towards the post-medieval period, there's a lot of abandoned buildings and structures that speak to the crofting activities and agriculture and pastoralism of past communities that inhabited this landscape as well. So we have lots of crofts. So at Little Grinard, there's perhaps a crofting building, or perhaps a fishing building that's again not marked on any of the maps, but there's a clear outline of the building there. One at Stirkill on the western shore of Loch Ewe, and also this lovely sheepfold that's making use of the cliff face there near Cove. So these are all really, really interesting aspects and features of their past lives. And here's one of a wonderful aerial photograph of an abandoned township or an abandoned croft at Plockenrother. And I've just taken this from the Canmore website, so you can see the lazy beds, you can see the agriculture here. So these would have been used in farming, but then you can also see this rectangular structure here, which is photographed just here. You can see obviously the vegetation is growing up and around it, and it's becoming slowly embedded into the peat, but it's very well documented. And then there's another one of the buildings associated with that township there, or that croft. But again, I say it's well documented. We've got the dimensions of these. We can record them, but there's really not a great deal of textual evidence that says what it is that this township was used for. There's not really a great deal of evidence at all. So this would be really fascinating, as to know when exactly it was that this was occupied, for example, what it is that people were doing here, why they were living here. And then some slightly more enigmatic structures as well. There's around 10 of these circular stone structures, and these are just a little ways up from the fishermen's bodies. And these might have been bodies themselves. They might be sheilings. They could be anything, frankly. They might be prehistoric hut circles. It's really, really difficult to know. But they're there, and we don't really know what they are either. So again, you can walk along and see them, but there's a lot of questions to ask. I'm going to focus in on Cove now, and you'll see on a map in a couple of slides as to where Cove is in its situation, because Cove really provided a lot of information, a lot of interesting sites. And if you're from around Gairloch, then you'll probably know the cave at Cove, also known as the Cave of the Fleas, apparently, in Gaelic. And there's some amazing multi-period use in here. There's oral history of it being used as a church, and apparently there used to be wooden pulpits in there and benches. And speaking with Hamish MacDonald, who's the landowner, said he knew of a lady who was baptised in there in the early 1920s. So it was still in use until very, very recently. And as we were fertling around and having a look, and I am most definitely wearing a hard hat, it's just invisible, we found some rifle shell casings, which probably attest to its use during the Second World War. And also a shell midden as well. So a shell midden is an accumulation of shells and animal bones and various bits and pieces. And we could see here down here, it's just a spread. It's against this wall over here. I've got my. I think that's the western wall. There were lots and lots of cockle shells and some limpets, and there was some animal bone in there, and some really large fish vertebrae, which were probably from cod. So this might be Norse, it might be medieval, but really, really interesting. So there's a huge amount of information that could be learned from looking at this cave and archaeological investigation into this cave. I don't think it's any earlier than that because the cod is so large. So I have worked on Mesolithic shell middens, but they don't tend to we don't tend to get cod that big in them. So this is probably potentially later prehistoric or yeah, perhaps Norse or medieval. And this really is the star of the show. And this is Cove Cave, next to Cove Cave, and this is a really not an exciting looking bit of dark mud, but this is what we were looking for. This is not an upstanding structure, this is buried archaeology and it's eroding. So this is exactly what the survey was designed to be looking for. And so it's underneath the turf, we can see this sort of dark layer of material, and within this dark layer of material there were some burnt stones, so we could see some flecks of charcoal coming from it, and we could see some worked stone tools as well. So this, I got really, really excited because this is pretty much what we've been looking for, and this replicates everything that I've been finding in the Western Isles. So we decided to have a bit more of a look around, and here we are investigating these eroding edges. So there's a burn that runs through the field, and it's basically the erosion is coming from ground slippage down to the bay, but also from the sheep who are using it as shelter from the elements. And you'll see from the photographs how variable the elements were as we were up in this lovely, lovely place. So yeah, basically just by investigating these edges and really paying close attention and inspecting every different soil discoloration, could we identify this. And here you can see this is where we put the trench for the excavation when we came back. And this is an aerial photograph that was taken before 2014. Of how the erosion that's been caused from the stream that's running through the field has run really, really close to the sites. So the eroding area, it's been backfilled by the landowner, but this was all the eroding area caused by the stream. And then this pipe basically got put in instead, so the pipe trenches in there to redirect it, because obviously it was causing a huge amount of damage to the field, which is used for grazing. So again, this is capturing not just this coastal erosion, but also the fact that there's significant erosion coming from the landward side as well, which is only going to be exacerbated further. And it also fits really nicely in terms of our model. It's here in one of these bays. It would be good for fishing, it's nice and sheltered. So really, it was ticking all the boxes for being something prehistoric and very, very exciting. So with a little bit of money that was left over from the grant that I got to come and do the survey, we came back and did a little bit of an excavation in June. And we put the trench along the eroding edge, so exactly where that first photograph was taken, where we could see the black layer eroding out, basically to try and see what it was. It's quite small, only 3 meters by 2.5 meters, and you can see here the pipe that's been to redirect the stream. But you can also see how the edge is slipping gradually into the sea. And yes, we found some more black stuff, and it's looking very interesting. It's looking quite exciting. In fact, you'll notice there's not so much black stuff on this side of the trench, and I think that's backfill from, I think it's just been slightly truncated and slightly cut by the stream. So that's part of the backfill, but I don't think it's been damaged too much. And it just kept getting blacker, and it was getting very interesting. But what is it? Because we've gone through it now, we can see from this photograph that it's not particularly thick, but it's very, very distinctive and very, very, very clear. And then all of a sudden it stops. We think it's a burnt mound. And that might not come as particularly a surprise. It's a mound of burnt material, very original. And what it was comprised of was a lot of heat-cracked rocks, heat-affected rocks, lots of charcoal fragments as well. We found some hammerstones and some coarse stone tools as well. So this is associated with a lithic working industry, so a stone tool working industry. We found lots and lots of bits of worked quartz and some tiny, tiny, tiny pottery fragments, no bigger than your thumbnail. No animal bone, no organic preservation at all. So, and I think that's come from the fact that it's really, really sandy deposits. So that's regrettable, but that's just the nature of the archaeology. But really, some really interesting results. And my thing is lithics, stone tools. So I've done a little bit of an analysis on them so far. In total, we got 325 pieces. And from this black layer, this burnt mound layer, we got some really interesting pieces. So we've got some blades, we've got some cores, so the nucleus that's left over when you start to reduce the material. You take off flakes and then you're left with the waste core. But we've also got some tools as well, so denticulated pieces. We've got some used pebbles as well and a scraper. And so this is really, really, really interesting because this is telling us about what it is that people are doing on the site or what they're throwing away. And it's dominated by quartz. And so quartz is a local raw material. It's really, really dominant in Scotland. There's not a great deal of flint. Flint doesn't naturally occur in Scotland. It's only ever dropped by the glaciers. It's not really rich as you get in southeast England because it forms in chalk. So that's really, really interesting because it tells us that people are using the local raw material, but they're using material that's maybe not local either, because bloodstone, which comprises sort of 2% of the assemblage that came from the Black Mound. This is bloodstone. It's really distinctive. It's this amazing green colour with these red flecks on it, so it looks like spatters of blood, I guess, which is where the name comes from. And bloodstone in this part of the world is only found on the island of Rum, which is on the far side of Skye, and I'll point it out to you on a map in a couple of slides. So this is really interesting. This is really exciting because it means that people are transporting this material here. There's some trade going on. So that's really, really exciting too. And here's just a few pictures of some of the artifacts. So we've got a denticulated flake, so that could have been used for something like cutting. It's not very big, so perhaps something like cutting cereals or cutting reeds or something like that. And we've got these waste cores that have been used, so they're quite big. People have been basically chipping away bits of quartz to use them as tools for whatever reason. And what the size of those cores tells me as well is that it's quite an abundant raw material. There's still a lot of material left on there that could be used. So that means people are treating it in quite a ad hoc way, quite a profligate way. You know, they're not bothered about conserving this material. So there's a good supply of it. So that's really, really interesting as well. And then there's this beautiful little scraper too. So I think that's maybe some kind of limestone or something. It's a bit difficult to determine what the material was. So that scraper is beginning to tell me what kind of date it might be. So what burnt mounds in Scotland? What do we know about burnt mounds in Scotland, other than the fact they're a mound of burnt material? Well, they're actually really, really common monuments. There are almost 2,000 known across Scotland, mostly up in the Northern Isles in Orkney and Shetland. And in the Highland region, there's 369 of them that have been reported. Maybe not all of them have been confirmed. Again, I think this density in the northeast is a research bias because people haven't been exploring in the west coast. But there are 7 suspected ones that have been identified in Gairloch, although going and trying to find them was completely unsuccessful, unfortunately. but they're quite distinctive as monuments. So we know about them, they're usually a crescent shape or an oval shape. They can be sort of about 20 meters cubed. Some of them apparently are absolutely massive. Those up on Orkney and Shetland can be up to 500 meters, for example. So they're really variable in terms of size. But one of the key things is that they're always situated near water. Now you'll remember that we found this site because it was starting to erode because of the stream. So that's really, really interesting. And that lends a suggestion as to the fact that this might be a burnt mound. They're usually Bronze Age in date. Apparently those in Scotland that have been excavated tend to cluster around the 2nd millennium, so around the Middle to Late Bronze Age. But there's been further dating on some that have shown that they can actually span from the late Neolithic into the early Iron Age as well, which is, so it could be Bronze Age, it's probably Bronze Age, but it's not a given. And as I said, they're really highly variable. And we know they're not just exclusive to Scotland, they're also found in Ireland, they're found in England and parts of Scandinavia as well. So they're a really interesting pan-Northwest European phenomenon. So that's quite interesting. So what's going on? What are they doing in this sort of northwesternmost extent of that? But what were they used for? Well, we know that they are created through basically the deposition of waste material from heating water using rocks. It's called hot rock technology. So you get the charcoal mixed in, you get all the heat affected rocks. So these are cracked because of thermal shock. So they're placed in a fire, they're heated and then placed into water. And then it's the thermal shock of the water basically cracks the rocks apart, and this causes the water to boil eventually as well. And those of it being excavated tend to be associated with troughs that are lined with stone or clay or wood. And the fact that they can sometimes be lined with clay was really interesting, because right at the back of the trench, there was this tiny, tiny little nose. I call it a nose because it kind of stuck out a bit like that. It was only about 10 centimeters across, but it was a really dense clay. So I think that potentially we've just clipped the edge of this burnt mound in the excavation. And that potentially there's more of the main body of the structure is actually preserved beyond. But they tend to be lacking in artefacts. I couldn't actually find any excavation reports from Scotland that's reported a lithic assemblage. So the fact that we've got artefacts in this one is really interesting. What are they doing there? What does that mean in terms of the site formation? What else are people doing in the region? But we don't actually know what they're for. We don't know what it is. I think there's no single purpose and there's no common consensus as to what they're used for. Some people have suggested that they're used for domestic purposes, so for cooking, but this conflicts with the lack of evidence for any animal remains or any plant remains that would be associated with that. They're potentially associated with bathing or sweat houses, for example. So this is drawing upon ethnographic evidence of known indigenous communities that use sweat house bathing technologies. And they've also been suggested to perhaps have been used in industrial technologies as well, so maybe for leatherworking, cloth processing, dyeing, these kinds of things. But it could be any or all of those. They're not mutually exclusive, I don't think. They've also been associated with ritual activities as well. So there could be a whole number of reasons. So it's quite exciting to think about what it is that this site at Ewmore could potentially be contributing to this understanding. But what's even more exciting is beneath the burnt mound, because we're going back even earlier into prehistory. Because beneath that, we've still got some interesting layers that aren't natural. There were still artifacts being found underneath the burnt mound. Now, there was a little bit of disturbance. There are a lot of rabbit holes around here. But we're confident that some of these areas were undisturbed. And what it is, and we can see directly underneath that is then the raised beach, the raised beach. So I've been talking about, when I was talking about this isostatic uplift, you know, we're about, let's say, 25 meters above sea level here, and here is the old beach surface. So we think what we've got is a land surface that has been occupied, and then later in prehistory, people are using this burnt mound, and it was right at the back here where we found the clay. So I think potentially the monument is kind of spanning right the way back, and we've just clipped the corner of it. Now, right at the very base of these underlying deposits, at the where it meets this raised beach, we found some really large pieces of charcoal, and we don't think that these were disturbed, and they were found with, again, quartz dominated stone tools, and really excitingly managed to get a radiocarbon date from one of them, and this dates to 3794 to around about 3655 Cal BC, which is really exciting, and you can tell I'm getting very excited, and I'll come on to tell you why. But again, we can see that the most significant thing about this is that it's associated with cultural activity. So, you know, it could be dismissed as the fact that, oh, these were burnt in a fire. Fires happen in, you know, in woodlands, of course. It seems surprising in northwest Scotland, but it can happen. But the fact that these are associated with these amazing hammerstones that have been used for probably for potentially pounding, maybe for some kind of cereal processing or plant processing, but also in lithic manufacture. And here's another lovely core. Really speaks to the fact that this is potentially humanly burned rather than naturally burned. Why is this date important? Well, not only is the fact that it's the first radiocarbon date within the vicinity for quite a significant area, it also falls within the first 200 years of the known Neolithic in the Atlantic zone. So that makes it incredibly early, which is really exciting. So you can see just the spread of the confirmed early Neolithic radiocarbon dates in this Atlantic zone. So really, it's filling a massive gap there. It's only one date, so you know, it's not a lot to hang on, but it's quite exciting nonetheless. Now, the arrival of the Neolithic in northwest Scotland is really complex. It's hotly debated. This is taken from Alistair Whittle and colleagues' publication that basically shows how the Neolithic kind of arrived in Scotland, and it's a range of transitions and people appearing, people moving, immigration in different waves, different phases. But what it doesn't take for is the fact that on Western Scotland, we've got some pottery that suggests there's connections with the Breton Peninsula, which is really exciting because it doesn't take this into account. So potentially we've got some really early Neolithic occupation here. And I've just noticed the time, and I'm really sorry, I've got far too excited. I've only got a few slides left to go, so if you can bear with me, because there's finally a really significant hint at even earlier occupation. And this is, I can't say too much about it, but there's potentially a Mesolithic shell midden in a rock shelter, and it's very exciting because there's some worked cores, there's some pebble tools, there's some lithic industries, and also the animal bone and shellfish assemblage that suggests it could be Mesolithic. So I'm really hopeful to get some more money to go and check that out. So the results so far. There's huge potential to find new archaeological information in these regions, and even just taking a walk and taking a look is really successful. It's low cost, and it works really well. We visited 25 known sites and found 6 more, and fortunately, with the exception of Umore, then none of these were at significant risk of erosion. But we're beginning to see that there is other factors, other erosive factors that are contributing to the damage to these sites. So vegetation growth, the instability from the eroding ground surface. So it's not coming from the coast, it's coming from the landward side, but they're still at risk. And also the fact that these early sites are not well recognised and easily at risk of being lost. So the future prospects, I'd really like to get some more dates. And it would be really interesting to see how these artefacts relate to its function. I want to do some more environmental analysis to find out what's going on in terms of the charcoal, the plant remains, and also soil formation. How long was the site occupied for? How long did it take to build up? And potentially some more excavation. And for the survey overall, I'd like to come back and do more because it's such a wonderful part of the world. And it would be really great to see if we could get some money to look at the potential Mesolithic rock shelter as well. So, and the fact that these, this raised shoreline means that there might be some prehistoric sites that are much further inland as well. So we need to consider that in terms of our research strategy. I can say more about that later, but thank you very much to everybody. And I shall stop talking now because I've held your attention for far too long.
Thank you so much, Steph, and you really have held our attention. That was a wonderful walkthrough of all the amazing archaeological sites and showing such a range of activities from different periods that we can find along our coastline, and your excitement about it is really infectious. I expect we might have some questions. There aren't any yet in the chat, but I guess that's because everyone's been so engrossed listening to you, they haven't had time to type. But if anyone would like to turn on their microphone and ask Steph a question directly, Tom Gardner, I think, has a question. Go ahead, Tom, unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Karen. Steph, that is hands down the best lecture I have seen this calendar year. Oh my goodness. It feels like an absolute homecoming. Those of you who've worked with me a little bit on the West Coast will know that I've got family just outside Gairloch, so that is wonderful. I'm an archaeologist myself, and my PhD was in the geoarchaeology of burnt mounds, and you've found one. So I think I feel a collaboration brewing, because I'm helping Karen and Jeremy and people excavate the Iron Age roundhouses at the back of the Gairloch Museum, and we desperately need a lithic specialist. And hopefully, if you go back to your lovely burnt mound, would you want a geoarchaeologist? So that leads to my question rather than just me ranting.
Yes, please.
Do you plan to go back?
I've got some Cuvianitins in my shed. I don't know what to do with them.
I will email you my address and we'll get them done. I'll do those mates rates. That's fine. That's free. Do you plan to go back and excavate? And would there be a community element to that? Could you scope that in?
Should Hez give me some money? Absolutely. Yeah, it was. I absolutely. Well, would love to. Unfortunately, I've run out of funds. It was a shoestring budget of £1,500. So, so yeah, I need to apply for some money to do it. At the minute, I'm a little bit hamstrung with the contract that I'm on. But yes, of course. I would love to come back and do some more excavation. And I would love to get the community involved. That was something I was talking with Mark just before everybody arrived, that we'd hoped to get NOSAS involved in the original survey, but unfortunately we just couldn't rally the troops in time. Everybody so obviously quite widely dispersed, and we couldn't necessarily always predict where we were going to be at any one time. So, but it would be, yeah, absolutely, I would love to.
Brilliant. Just a little tiny further bit of information. I helped Daniel Rhodes at the National Trust of Scotland dig one of the burnt mounds at Inverewe, just across the bay on the Inverewe estate. That's got 3 radiocarbon dates, which kind of focus around 2030 Cal BC. That's not published. I've been trying to get it published by Daniel soon, but I'll send you the interim report for that so you can work that into your analysis going forward. But so there is another dated early Bronze Age one just across the loch from you. A quick question about pottery. You found pottery. Can you speak a bit more to that, and then I'll shut up.
I can't too much, only on account of the fact that I haven't had the report back from the specialist, and literally the biggest piece is the size of your thumbnail. So I'm not sure. I couldn't afford to pay him and offered to buy him dinner, and he looked at the assemblage and said, "Dinner's too much." So it's whether or not we're going to get much information from the pottery, I don't know. There is a tiny room sherd of something, but any more than that, it's really scrappy. But
that's still remarkable. That's
yeah.
still really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm glad we were able to do that little bit of matchmaking there. And Tom knows where one of your burnt mines is, Steph, and he'll be able to show you. I've got a question here from Jen Valentine. She says, thanks very much for such a brilliant talk. And she's asking about the artifacts, the lithics that you find in the burnt mine, whether you think that the fact that you find such rare artifacts that haven't been found in other sites is due to the poor quality of recording in other sites, or is it a unique feature of this site?
That's a very good question. Thanks, Jen. I think we just don't know enough about burnt mounds. I don't profess to be a specialist, so maybe Tom could back me up on this potentially. I think it's, as I understand it, there are only 3% of burnt mounds in Scotland have ever been excavated. So that's a really, really small data set to be working with. The majority of those have been done in the Northern Isles and Northeast Scotland. So I think potentially there is a function disparity. So potentially these things might not all necessarily have been used for the same thing. Maybe some were used for bathing, maybe some that were used for domestic purposes. So maybe it's the fact that those that have been published well don't happen to have been used for these purposes. The ones that have been excavated well, I don't think it's that they've not been well recorded. I think that those have been, but also the fact that they're just not well investigated as monuments overall. So there's just so much, we don't really know what they're for. So I think there's a lot of questions, and that's, I think, yeah, the success of the project really. You know, if you measure archaeological success by how many more questions you ask than answer, we've definitely been very successful there. So sorry, I'm not sure I can answer your question, Jen. We don't know.
I might take one or two more other questions. We're just a little bit over time, but if anyone has a question, do unmute yourself and ask just now. I have a tip-off for you on the scallops, the scallop factory. So from Anne McInnes, thanks Anne. So we'll pass the contact details for that on to you.
Can I ask what Cal BC means in connection with a date?
You can, and I will do my best to answer that in a very short space of time. BC, before Christ, so the year 0, or BCE, before the Common Era, year 0. The calibrated bit is to do with something called the calibration curve, which relates to the atmospheric carbon. So carbon, as part of the carbon cycle, natural organisms absorb carbon, and then when they die, they release it. And carbon 14 has a decay rate of I've forgotten what the decay, something 5754, I think. So it decays at that rate. So it's a known decay rate. But the levels, so we can use that to work out how old things are for radiocarbonating, but then also the rate of which carbon is in the atmosphere varies over time. So it's there's really, really complex models that basically take measurements of what it's known from various isotope studies. People far more clever than I. They match it against things like tree ring dating and things like that to produce a calibrated curve. It's constantly being refined. In fact, my dates for the date there were actually more we're tighter under the previous curve, and then the new curve just got released this year, which is really frustrating because it means that they're worse. But it's really complicated, and I'm not sure I fully understand the calibration curve, but it's basically how we get from now to then in as scientific a terms as possible. Does that help?
Well, I think
I'm just glad you don't understand it either.
I'll just stay with BC. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's BC. The calibrated bit is to do with the way the data is converted.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Jen is saying that she's part of Historic Ascent, and if you're ever working up in that area, please get in touch with them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've probably reached the end. In fact, we've gone over our usual hour together, but it's been absolutely fascinating, so that's not a problem. Thank you for your company. Thanks again to Steph. Good evening. Euch war.